Hi, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Caroline Lee, although typically I go by Carly. I'm a Master's of Arts in Biology student with the Advanced Inquiry Program, which is run by Miami University in Ohio, alongside Project Dragonfly, and here in Seattle, they're partnered with the Woodland Park Zoo. As part of my master's work, I have been focusing a lot on urban aquatic environments, particularly wetlands and other freshwater habitats, as well as coastal areas. As part of that research, I became very interested in the impacts of dogs on these environments, and that is what I'm going to talk to you about today. So, what is the issue with dogs? We all love our furry friends, especially our dogs. They're often, sometimes referred to as our fur babies. And they're our adventure and exploration buddies in the outdoors, especially here in the Pacific Northwest. But what kind of environmental impact might they be having? I mean, they are animals, right? Well, it turns out it's not quite so simple. I mean, dogs are animals, but they're different from wildlife. Our dogs resemble their wild counterparts, like foxes and coyotes, but they exist at a very high density, which is way beyond what would happen in nature. Because they are man's best friend, dogs have become practically ubiquitous and the most numerous carnivore on the planet. In Seattle, where I am based, the number of dogs is estimated to be 187,000, which is more than the number of children in the city. So here's a little thought experiment for you. The city proper is 84 square miles. If we're thinking of coyotes as an analog for domestic dogs, if we consider that an adult coyote pack consists of, on average, 3 to 7 adults, and their territory is between 4 and 15 square miles typically. So if we assume the largest group size, 7 adults, and the smallest territory size, 4 square miles, that would only equal around 150 adult resident coyotes in the same area as the city of Seattle occupies. So, I mean, that's pretty clearly a much lower number than 180,000, which is approximately the number of dogs that live in this city right now. That's an amazingly high density compared to what we might find similar animals if this was a wilderness area. As a master's student, I've become very passionate about this topic. I'm a dog lover, a dog owner, and so my goals are to improve access to safe outdoor recreation for dogs and people. Outdoor recreation is really important for our mental and physical health and the health of our dogs as well. As I mentioned, there are estimated to be over 180,000 dogs in Seattle, but within the actual city, there are only 14 dog parks. And only one of these has access to beach and swimming area, which is Magnuson Park. My second goal is to protect vulnerable native wildlife and their habitats. With increasing urbanization, many native species are under pressure, as well as their habitats, which are important for their survival. And by becoming more environmentally responsible pet parents, I think we can really do our part to protect these vulnerable populations. So, the main habitats that I'm concerned with and that I have been focusing on in my master's work are wetlands and coastal beach areas. These are of particular conservation importance around the world, including here in the Pacific Northwest. Wetlands are often the first habitats to absorb any excess nutrients or pollutants present in the environment, usually through surface runoff into streams and rivers, and they perform a very important environmental service in this way by absorbing these nutrients and helping to keep our water clean. However, then on the flip side of that, they can become very easily damaged by these nutrients and pollution because they accumulate in the wetlands. And this is, of course, also detrimental to the animals that depend on wetlands, such as amphibians. Amphibians particularly are often impacted because of their semi-permeable skin, which allows them to absorb some of these nasty environmental pollutants, and also because they live both on land and in water at different stages of their life, so they are often exposed to a wide range of different pollutants and chemicals. Beaches and intertidal areas are very delicate ecosystems and also home to many species that are ecologically important and can be easily disturbed. Here in the Pacific Northwest, in Seattle in particular, we have lots of beaches such as those found at Carkeek Park that are important spatial corridors for migrating animals. In particular, spawning salmon, they often have to travel through these intertidal areas to get to the streams where they were hatched so that they can return to spawn and die, leaving their nutrients in those streams to feed the environment. And they can't do that if those beaches become polluted or obstructed or damaged. It certainly would make it more difficult. So what are the main species of interest? I have mentioned them already. Salmon and amphibians are animals that I am particularly interested in studying and which I feel are often overlooked in the conversation of the impacts of dogs on the environment. Of course, dogs also have impacts on other species, particularly birds and mammals such as beavers, which I singled out here because of their importance in maintaining wetlands and healthy aquatic environments. On the left here, we have some pictures of different amphibians, as well as a picture at the top of a spawning coho salmon, which I took in Carkeek Park last fall when I was working with the stream survey, which they do every year to monitor the salmon population. To make this a bit easier to understand before I jump into some examples, I've sort of outlined 5 different categories of ways that dogs can impact the environment. The first is pollution through waste. I think this is one we probably all know. It gets a lot of attention. There's lots of signs in parks to remind you to pick up after your dog, and often here in Seattle, some great programs that provide doggy bags for that purpose. This one is important to consider. The excess nutrients I talked about that can be a pollutant and can be damaging to environment. A lot of that some of it at least, comes from animal waste that is left in our environment. And this can also lead to our second category here, which is disease transmission. Our dogs are animals, but they're separate from their wild counterparts in a lot of ways, including what we feed them, the diseases they're exposed to, all sorts of environmental factors, and they can, through their waste and through other methods, transmit dangerous diseases to our wildlife populations. So another great reason to pick up after your dog. Number 3, landscape of fear. This is kind of a nerdy ecological term, and it's not necessarily a negative thing. However, to break it down, if you're not familiar with the term, this refers to how the presence of predators impacts the way other animals utilize the environment. So that's a perfectly natural process. However, when you get such high densities of animals like we have with domestic dogs, this can start to have some negative cascading impacts on the environment. So, for example, if we have deer living in a forest, suddenly the deer are avoiding this one corner of the forest because we're walking our dogs there. Well, those deer don't just disappear, right? Now they're all in that other half of the forest, and that's twice as many deer in that space. So if you can see what I'm getting at, by pushing animals into other areas of the habitat through their presence, through the innate fear wild animals have of our dogs, we're having other impacts on the environment that we might not be seeing, but are definitely there and can be negative if, they're magnified to a certain extent. Number 4 is wildlife injury and mortality. This is another one that I think can be quite visible. If our dogs chase animals, which does come somewhat naturally to them, that can cause stress and injury to the animal. If they catch them, certainly that can also cause injury, can also introduce diseases and possibly cause mortality. So that's definitely something to be aware of. And finally, we have physical disturbance of habitat. If our dogs go off trail in natural areas, they could be disturbing the soil and the plants. And sure, native wildlife do that too. However, if we think back to how high the density of our domestic dogs is, that could quickly compound and become a larger issue. So it's very important to keep our dogs from disturbing these delicate habitats. Particularly, we have here in the Pacific Northwest our alpine, our mountainous areas. The soil is often not very deep. The plants are very delicately attached, so it can be quite detrimental to them for them to be disturbed by lots of paws digging around. All right, now I'm going to move into some more specific examples, starting with mammals. So in this paper by Weston and Stankiewicz, they found that many animals, particularly mammals such as deer, rabbits, and a variety of other small mammals, they tend to reduce their activity near trails where dogs were allowed. This is another example similar to what I was mentioning, the landscape of fear, how the presence of our dogs is altering this habitat use by other animals. They also showed that uncontrolled dogs, which generally means unleashed dogs, they will often harass marine mammals resting on beaches and shore areas, sometimes injuring or even killing them. This is important here in Washington to consider. In the summer, seals and other pinnipeds and marine mammals will haul out on the beach. They'll often be giving birth to pups around this time of year. And generally, these are animals we find in our environment frequently, and it's important to be aware of our dogs and what they are doing and have them on leash in areas where these animals might be present. In another article by Length and colleagues, they studied the impacts of dogs on wildlife in California, particularly other carnivores. And they showed that bobcats avoided natural areas where dogs were allowed, and that coyotes would shift their peak active hours to avoid recreationists, so people and also dogs that accompany their people in the outdoor recreation activities. And so this is another example of how even just the presence of our dogs in the environment, other animals are aware of that and they adjust their behavior accordingly. Moving on, talking about birds now. So in this first paper by Holderness Rodham, they studied natural areas where dogs were allowed to be walked and found that there was a 35% reduction in bird species diversity and a 41% reduction in birds in general in their abundance as compared to other natural areas where dogs were prohibited. And in a study by Lafferty, they found that on a beach in California, only 10% of the people they observed disturbed birds, and that was compared to 39% of dogs that were observed disturbing birds. So I think this is some very clear numbers of the impacts that dogs can have on our feathered friends, especially in coastal areas where we like to walk our dogs sometimes. All right, and moving on to some of my favorite animals, fish and amphibians. So these first two examples both kind of prove the same point. They both show that dog waste in the natural environment can be very damaging to our local waterways and our coastal areas, particularly due to the high level of nutrients that is found in the waste, phosphorus especially. An excess of those kinds of nutrients can cause damage to our environment and to our urban watersheds, which are very important. This other article illuminated the fact that dogs can outcompete native scavengers for beached fish carcasses. This article was particularly interesting to me given my background with salmon and my knowledge of their importance here in the Pacific Northwest, because spawning salmon, once they return to their stream to spawn and die, those carcasses that they leave behind are really important for the health of our ecosystems. They fertilize trees and provide food for native scavenger animals like coyotes and raccoons and various bird species. So they're a very integral part of our environment. And if dogs are placing these or removing them from the environment, that could have some negative impacts on the rest of the ecosystem. So what can we do to help to mitigate these? I mean, I've mentioned it a little bit already, but leashes are really important tools for managing the impacts of our dogs on the environment. Not only do they prevent them from chasing animals and disturbing perhaps their dens or their nests, it also helps to keep them from going off trail and to help us keep an eye on them so we can pick up after them. And because leash dogs are much easier for owners to monitor and control. There are other reasons to obey local leash laws and regulations besides protecting the environment, although that is very important. Keeping your dog on a leash is important for your dog's safety as well as the safety of other people and other dogs enjoying these natural areas. You never know what people might be afraid of dogs or which dogs may be unfriendly or reactive towards your dog. And by keeping your dog on a leash, you help to manage these potential risks. When people visit a park that has leash laws and someone else is ignoring these rules and letting their dog off leash, in my opinion, that person, they're not only breaking the law, but they're also endangering their dog and other park visitors. Off-leash areas have rules that you have to agree to. They have fences. They have all these measures that help to protect dogs and people and the environment. But by letting your dog off leash where it's not supposed to be, you're sort of introducing a level of risk to the community that people have not really signed up for. And very importantly as well, if your dog then injures someone or becomes injured, that falls on you as the dog owner. That's your responsibility. If you're interested in learning more about the leash laws, particularly here in Seattle, I've created this handy-dandy map on Google Maps that outlines a lot of the different leash laws and also highlights off-leash areas in Seattle. I think leash laws are often misunderstood here in the city, and it's actually pretty simple. If your dog's not in an off-leash area, they need to be on leash. There's also what frequently it's misunderstood too here in Seattle that dogs are not allowed on any Seattle Park beaches. The only exception to this is the beach area I mentioned at Magnuson. That falls within the off-leash area. And there is as well an off-leash area at Golden Gardens, which is sort of beach adjacent. So I've created this map here to hopefully clarify some of these regulatory issues and just to be a resource for dog owners and outdoor recreationists. I've also included some icons that highlight local areas that have ecologically important habitats and species that are important to be aware of. So if you're curious, you want to learn more, you can scan the QR code. It'll take you to the map. Another important tool for maintaining our local natural areas is signage, although as you can tell by this slide, I have a lot of feelings about this and a lot of opinions on how signage can be improved, some of which are backed up by research. So these first examples, quite degraded and quite small, and the trees are encroaching. Second one, similarly, it does outline critical wildlife habitat, but it doesn't quite explain what that means, and the font is quite small. Larger, more eye-catching images and symbols would certainly be more effective. This third example is very small as well and placed far off the trail. It's not in people's direct eye line, and it is frequently missed, I would assume, and it's easy to miss. It's not in your direct eyesight. It's kind of, in the peripheral. So in my opinion, if we focus more on displaying on these signs images that represent, the important habitats and species that are present, it would help to create more powerful signs and would inspire more rule following. This next slide is just some more examples of signage. On the left, this is a close-up of that third example from the previous slide, as well as a sign stating dogs are not allowed at beaches and Seattle parks, and federally protected wetlands. So when you're out in your local natural areas, look out for these kinds of signs, although they do leave much to be desired, but they are there. And it's important when you're going to natural areas to research beforehand the rules and regulations, especially if you're bringing your dog. Those are really important things to know. So I've talked some about individual actions, particularly leashes, things that we can do as individuals, things to look out for. But what are some positive community actions that we could do to make parks better for people and dogs and the environment? Well, you can voice your support for local environmental regulations and parks improvement projects like improvements to signs, as well as here in Seattle. In the news recently, Seattle Parks has been advertising that they're seeking input on the locations of possible new off-leash dog parks, which is amazing. We need more dog parks. So if you're in the Seattle area, definitely go look that up and put in your comments. We can also advocate for things like the creation of park ranger programs. Park rangers are shown to improve compliance with leash laws simply by their presence. They can also be a really good tool for educating the public, answering questions. They can be just sort of representatives of the park, encourage people to respect nature, as well as, like I said, answer any questions they may have about why the rules are in place or what animals live there. I think if we could fund some more park rangers, we would be all the better for it. And finally, you can volunteer with some local environmental restoration projects. And here in Seattle, we have some really cool local environmental organizations that are doing awesome work. I've mentioned the Magnuson Dog Park. Well, it's run by the Magnuson Off-Leash Group, which is a nonprofit, and they're doing a lot of really cool work to expand their beach area so dogs can have more swimming space. They're also planting native plants within the park and really doing a lot of cool work to maintain and improve that dog park for people and humans and the environment. So definitely go check them out if you're interested in those kinds of things. They have planting parties and work parties, so you can definitely get hands-on and help out. Also, the Karkik Watershed Community Action Project is a really cool organization. I mentioned the stream survey that happens at Karkik briefly, and these are the people who run it. It's a really cool way to get involved, and even if you can't volunteer, you can still visit the park in the fall. They'll have people there that can talk to you about the salmon as they're returning to spawn. It's a really cool organization. And finally, the Woodland Park Zoo, which I have the pleasure of working with closely a lot through my master's program. They have a very cool community science project called the Amphibian Monitoring Program. Teams go out in their local area and they survey urban watersheds, wetlands for amphibians, and record really important data on the populations of these species that really can tell us a lot about the health of the environment based on how well their populations are doing and if they're present or not in certain areas. Continuing on sort of a more positive note, I wanted to outline a few cool organizations that show how dogs can really be active in not only not just be a neutral, not damaging the environment force, but being an actively positive force for environmental protection and conservation. So the rogue detection teams are groups of researchers and scientists and their partnered conservation detection dogs. So these dogs are trained to sniff out the scent of different endangered animals, and typically their poop or their scat, which is the fancy science term for poop. And by doing this, they help researchers collect data on the presence of these endangered and rare species in the environment, as well as when they find poop, they can collect that and take it back to the lab and learn a lot about how these animals are doing, their stress levels, their hormones, all kinds of things that they can learn from that poop, which is really fascinating. And this picture here on the right, which I copied from their Instagram page, which you should definitely give them a follow. It's a very uplifting, fun page to follow. This shows some of the different animals that they have trained dogs to find. Orcas, they send dogs out on boats and they track orcas and collect our poop. Little rough-skinned newts, toads, butterflies, all kinds of things all over the world. They send their teams to track animals and help conservation scientists. It's very cool. There's also a really cool livestock guardian program that's run by Cheetah Conservation Fund. And so these help to prevent wildlife conflict. So in Namibia, where cheetahs often prey on farmers' livestock, they've trained these guardian dogs. They distribute them to farmers, and these dogs have shown to reduce losses of livestock through predation by 80 to 100%. So not only does this help the farmers, but it also helps the cheetahs because it reduces that source of tension between the farmers and the cheetahs. So this is a really cool way that dogs are helping to protect human livelihoods, but also to reduce human-wildlife conflict. All right, that is my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. I would love to hear any comments or feedback. If there's anything I didn't cover or things you want to know more about, or really any suggestions, any feedback, I would really appreciate it. You can scan this QR code. It'll take you to a little Google form that'll have just a few questions and some areas where you can just write your thoughts. I would love to hear them. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it.